Something is wrong here. What were they intended to open? At first, that sounds like the kind of question with an easy answer. You look at them. You make a simple assumption. And that should be enough. That is usually how these things work. An object has a purpose. A purpose points to a use. And a use points to something it was made to open. So you settle into that. You expect a fit. You expect the shape to make sense. You expect the answer to be sitting there, plain and ordinary. But then something does not sit where it should. The more you look, the less that easy answer feels complete. Not because it disappears. It is still there. It still sounds reasonable, but it does not hold the way it should. It leaves space where there should not be space. It suggests one thing, then quietly refuses to stay there. And that is where the discomfort starts. Because now the object is still in front of you, still familiar enough to seem understood, and yet not familiar in the way you need it to be. It feels close to obvious, close enough to trust, close enough to stop asking, but not close enough to rest. So, what were they intended to open? At first glance, the question seems easier than it should be. In the apse, above the papal throne, two oversized gilded keys cross in the half-dark like a fixed answer. The same pair reappears on vestments in procession. One gold, one silver, suspended against embroidery dense with authority. In the treasury, a ceremonial key longer than a forearm lies on red velvet. Its bow broad, its shaft thick, its surface made to catch light rather than pass through a keyhole. If these are the keys of St. Peter, then perhaps they were never meant to open anything at all. They read cleanly as insignia, portable theology in metal form, a sign of office rather than an instrument. That explanation holds for a while, because the objects cooperate with IT. Their scale is wrong for ordinary use. Their finish is too deliberate. Their display context is public, elevated, processional. Even the nearby architecture seems to agree. A carved church door fills one wall, but no lock on it could admit the ceremonial keys shown beside it. The mismatch is almost useful. It separates symbol from mechanism. The keys signify access. They do not perform it. And once that distinction is made, several details settle into place. Crossed keys on seals, banners, thrones, vestments. These belong to a visual language of jurisdiction. A key can stand for custody without ever touching a ward. A pair can suggest powers divided or joined without requiring any corresponding pair of locks. The question, what were they intended to open, begins to look slightly misplaced, as if it assumes a practical function the surviving evidence does not ask us to assume. Then the practical problem returns from the edge of the record. Not in the gilded pieces, in the ignored notices. Iron keys kept as relics. References, brief and awkward, to openings on certain feast days. Mentions of access below the altar. Those reports are easy to set aside while the ceremonial objects dominate the frame. They are harder to dismiss when the visible evidence is arranged by material, rather than by prestige. Gold and silver remain above ground, in light, in procession. Iron appears in inventories of restricted places. A different image begins to intrude. Not the apse, but a narrow stair descending beneath the basilica. Not velvet, but stone and lamp smoke. At the bottom, a grated chamber. Beyond it, a low space under St. Peter's altar. Here the scale changes. A plain iron key with an undecorated bow, hanging beside a sealed entrance, asks a more literal question than the gilded pair ever did. It does not advertise authority. It belongs to a threshold. That would explain the old stories neatly enough. At least some keys of St. Peter may have been understood as opening access to his burial place, or to the confession near it. The guarded approach, the restricted chambers, the iron, rather than precious metal. All of it fits a controlled sacred space better than a ceremonial emblem does. The keys would still be Peter's, but now by proximity to his tomb, rather than by abstraction. Yet, even here, the fit is not complete. The records do not preserve one stable form. The surviving references do not point to one unmistakable lock. And if the key was for a single tomb entrance, why do descriptions multiply instead of narrowing? Why does the evidence preserve not one practical shape, but several? At first, the question seems easier than the object itself. Not the jeweled crossed keys carried in processions, not the oversized forms painted above thrones, but the dark iron ones that keep turning up in inventories and reliquary lists. One of them lies in a tray beside bone fragments and wax seals, plain bowed, narrow-shafted, with none of the enlargement expected from insignia. It looks as if it belonged to a lot. The immediate problem is obvious. Which one? The spaces beneath the basilica offer a tempting answer. A narrow stair drops toward a grated chamber under oil lamp light. Below the altar, the architecture tightens into controlled access. Low passages, barriers. A gate before a stone recess associated for centuries with Peter's burial place. Early references to the confessio do not describe open circulation. They describe approach, restriction, permission. Once that pattern is in view, the iron key on the wall beside a sealed shrine entrance stops looking symbolic and starts looking administrative. A guarded burial site would require a real barrier. A real barrier would require a real key. For the first time, the phrase, "Keys of St. Peter," seems capable of meaning something practical. That explanation gains weight from scale. The plain iron examples are small enough to fit actual lock plates found on medieval grills and shrine doors. Their metal is not gilded, not enlarged for display, not shaped for visibility at a distance. They belong to enclosed spaces, not ceremonial sightlines. If Peter's remains were approached through a controlled chamber, then at least some keys attributed to him may have been intended to open the gate before the tomb, or the shrine built over it, or the access point to the confessio itself. The setting, the material, and the restricted route all line up. Then the route becomes too crowded. The chamber under the altar is not the only secured threshold in the complex. The stair breaks at one barrier, then another. Grills appear before side spaces. Sealed recesses sit behind metalwork of different dates. A key that might suit a gate at one level is too short for a deeper set lock plate elsewhere. The iron key in the reliquary tray has a bit cut for one pattern of words. The key hanging by the shrine entrance shows a different profile entirely. If both were linked to Peter, were both opening the tomb? Or were they opening different things near the tomb? The records do not simplify this. References to access cluster around the burial place, but access is not the same as one door. It can mean descent, approach, viewing aperture, enclosure, secondary grill. A locked metal gate before the low stone space under the altar seems to settle the matter until the dimensions are compared with surviving keys. One bow is too cramped for gloved ceremonial use, but suitable for a custodian's hand. Another shaft is too slender for a heavy outer gate, yet plausible for an inner screen or reliquary housing. The practical explanation still holds, but it has begun to divide. And that division raises a sharper question than the first one. If these iron keys were intended to open Peter's tomb, why do they appear in forms suited to different lock depths, different ward patterns, and different levels of access around the same sacred center? The answer may still lie beneath the basilica. It just may not lie behind a single lock. The first arrangement looks promising because it is so orderly. 3 keys attributed to St. Peter lie side by side on dark cloth, each tagged from a different treasury inventory. If the old reports about access beneath the altar are taken seriously, then one of them ought to stand out as the practical one. The right length for a deep medieval lock, the right bit for a gate, the right wear for repeated use. Instead, the shafts disagree. One is short and thick, one long and narrow, one intermediate with a bit cut in a pattern neither of the others shares. Set beside each other, they do not look like copies of a single originally. They look like answers to different mechanisms. That would still leave room for one tomb key and 2 later imitations, until the drawer is opened in the archive cabinet. Several more labeled keys sit in separate compartments, each linked in old handwriting to Peter, to the confessio, to a chapel, to a chain relic. Their wards do not match. Some have open bows, some flattened loops, some stems too slight for a heavy door. If one lock is the target, why preserve so many incompatible forms under the same attribution? The obvious place to test that question is not the labels, but the barriers. In one church, a high bronze gate carries a broad lock case mounted above waist height. In another, A small iron chest uses a compact warded lock with a narrow throat. Elsewhere, a stone screen grille closes off a chapel opening with a long, recessed keyhole. The dimensions are not abstract. A short key would never reach the grille mechanism. A long key with a broad bit would not enter the chest. Looking from lock to lock, the multiplication of keys begins to make practical sense. Perhaps, the keys of St. Peter meant custody over several protected places connected with him, not one burial chamber alone. That explanation settles neatly for a moment, because the churches themselves are full of separate thresholds. A guarded grille near an altar, a chest for relic textiles, a gate before a lower passage. Distinct locks, distinct keys, one saintly attribution spread across a network of sacred enclosures. The variety in shaft length and ward shape stops being a problem and starts looking like a map. Then the chains appear. In one chapel, a reliquary of iron chains sits under glass, catalogued with Peter's imprisonment. In another part of the same complex, a locked grille bars access to a different sacred space. The records do not keep these apart as cleanly as the architecture does. A key listed in one century beside access to the confessio is listed in another beside the chains. Another key is described not by door or gate at all, but by proximity to a reliquary. If these were simply a ring of practical keys for separate barriers, why do the attributions drift toward objects that are displayed, enclosed, and venerated, rather than entered? The three keys on the cloth now look less like a set of tools than a set of claims. Yet their differences remain stubbornly physical. Different wards are not poetic. Different shaft lengths answer to different depths. So what, exactly, were they intended to open? One tomb, several sacred compartments, or something more distributed through the churches? Gates, chests, grilles, and reliquaries, all gathered under Peter's name, because each marked a controlled point of approach. The labels do not decide it. The locks do not agree. And the chains keep pulling the question away from any single door. The question sounds simple until the keys are laid out by size and wear. If they were meant to open something, what exactly could these small ones have served? Not the doors that dominate the basilica treasury. Those ceremonial forms are too large, too gilded, too detached from any visible lock. The more persuasive objects are the modest iron examples. One thin-shafted key, resting in a pilgrim ampulla case, another on linen among flasks and badges, another hanging in a side chapel beside the shrine of St. Peter's chains. They are portable, ordinary in metal, and close in scale to things people actually carried away. That begins to answer the question. A key in a pilgrim case does not need to fit a gate if its value lies elsewhere. The bow of one example is polished smooth, not in the places a lock would grind it, but where fingers would repeatedly hold it. Its bit is shallow and blunt. Another has rounded edges along the shaft, as if the iron had been filed down by touch rather than by use. In inventories and pilgrimage accounts, touched objects recur. Cloths laid on shrines, oil taken from lamps, tokens brought into contact with relics, and then preserved as extensions of sanctity. Set beside the chapel of the chains, these little keys begin to look less like tools than like conductors. They may have been touched to Peter's shrine, or to the chains associated with him, and then carried away as charged objects. For a moment, that arrangement accounts for nearly everything in front of us. The missing lock no longer matters. The small scale makes sense. The blunt bits stop being defects. Even the repeated smoothing becomes useful evidence. Not operation, but handling. Not custody, but circulation. Then, the surfaces ask for a closer distinction. On one key, the bow is polished, yes, but the bit is not merely blunt. Its edges are uneven in a way that resembles contact with metal resistance, not just devotional rubbing. Another key from the same group shows bright thinning at one corner of the bit, while the shaft remains comparatively intact. If these were only touched to a shrine and tucked into pouches, why is the wear concentrated where a lock would register it? Why do some examples look softened everywhere, while others seem marked at specific working points? Placement complicates it further. The cluster of portable keys beside the chain suggests a devotional function, but not all of them are equally slight. A few are small enough for a pilgrim's pouch, yet still proportioned like reduced working keys, with defined words rather than symbolic outlines. If they were made only to receive contact, why preserve word patterns at all? If they were miniature copies of a more important key, copies of which one? The side chapel offers one answer and withholds another. The association with Peter's chains is too persistent to ignore. Keys and chains belong together in the records, and the chapel setting explains why these objects traveled outward from Rome. But contact relic does not need mechanical precision, and several of these keys retain just enough of it to keep the original question alive. They may have been carried for blessing. They may also have remembered a lock. The difficulty is that the same object can show the polish of devotion and the geometry of use, and once that is visible, what were they intended to open? No longer points to a single door. The small keys had seemed to settle the matter. Their shafts were thin, their bits shallow, their edges rounded down by handling rather than force. Set beside flasks and badges in pilgrim deposits, they looked like things meant to be carried, touched, and kept close. If they had ever opened anything, it was hard to see what. A shrine perhaps, or Peter's chains, touched by contact, and then taken away as portable access in another sense. Then the larger iron key from the sacristy drawer was brought into the same line of sight. Its bow was not merely polished. A crack ran from the inner curve into the shaft, the kind of split that forms where torque repeats through the same turning point. The bit showed bright thinning at two corners, not the soft smoothing of fingers or cloth, but abrasion concentrated where metal meets resistancy. The wear sat low and directional. It had entered something, turned against something, and done so often enough to alter its shape. That invited a simpler answer. Some of the so-called keys of St. Peter were just working keys. Not symbols, not touched relics, but tools for a protected place. The fortified shrine door supports that reading at once. Its lock plate is rubbed bright around the keyhole, the shine confined to the exact arc where a heavy key would scrape before seating. The door itself is built for custody, not display. Iron straps, reinforced frame, no decorative enlargement of the opening. A key like the cracked one belongs here more easily than in a reliquary cabinet. And once that possibility appears, other details begin to align around it. Several keys hang from a custodian's board, one larger than the rest. Darker grease still gathered near the bit. Not ceremonial oiling, but the residue of use. Sacred thresholds were not left unattended. Accessed below altars, behind grills, into enclosed chambers. Those spaces required control, and control requires hardware. The question, what were they intended to open, starts to narrow toward actual doors. But the narrowing does not hold cleanly. The worn key in the drawer is heavy, yet its shaft length does not match the depth of the lock housing on the fortified door now associated with it. The bit wear is concentrated on one side, while the scrape marks around that keyhole suggest a different angle of entry. On the custodian's board, the greased key has a broader bow and a shorter reach. It would sit differently in the hand and engage a different mechanism. If one key opened the shrine door, what opened the inner grill? What opened the chest for chains? What opened the chamber below? The problem is no longer whether any of these keys work. Some plainly did. The problem is that mechanical use multiplies the locks instead of identifying one. Even the devotional pieces become harder to isolate. A small portable key with a blunt bit may not suit a robust door. Yet one edge is nicked in a way handling does not explain. The polished bow suggests years on a cord or in a pouch. The slight brightening at the bit suggests at least occasional engagement with metal. Trial use? Ritual touching against a lock? A token cut from the form of a working key rather than from pure symbolism? The shrine door remains in place, its plate bright at the opening. The cracked iron key remains in the drawer, stressed by repeated turning in. The board of custodial keys remains uneven, practical, unceremonial. Together, they answer the old question too well and not well enough. They were intended to open something real. The difficulty is that something keeps becoming plural. Under glass in the papal treasury, the familiar answer seems almost too easy. A gold key and a silver key cross at the stems, balanced for display rather than use. Their bows are broad, their surfaces chaste and polished, their bits too clean, too declarative. Nearby, on a manuscript page, painted keys accompany lines about custody, binding, blessing. If the question is what the keys of St. Peter were intended to open, this arrangement offers a tidy reply. Not a door, but office itself. Authority made visible. Access in the legal and sacred sense, not the mechanical one. That reading holds for a moment, because the objects cooperate. The ceremonial pair sits in a treasury, not near any threshold. Their scale suits insignia. Their medals suit rank. The text beside them speaks in the language of charge and guardianship. Nothing in that case asks for a lock. Then below the basilica, the proportions change. In a stone passage, a separate ring of black iron keys hangs against the wall, each one narrow, dark, and practical in a way the treasury pair is not. Their shafts differ. One is long enough to reach through a deep-set escutcheon. Another has a compact bit with pronounced wards. They are not decorative echoes of the crossed emblem above. They are keyed to distance, depth, and obstruction. The passage itself narrows toward restricted spaces. Doors here are thick, hinges recessed, openings controlled in stages. If these are also called Peter's keys, then at least some of them were intended to open protected places associated with him, not merely represent his authority. That explanation gains force from separation. Gold and silver above, iron below, display in one place, custody in another. The distinction feels almost administrative. Symbolic keys for the papacy, working keys for shrine access. But in the reliquary cabinet, the categories begin to crowd each other. Rows of small portable keys lie sealed in cloth packets. They are too slight for the heavy locks below. Several have shallow bits with little cutting depth. A few are scarcely larger than devotional badges. Yet, they are preserved carefully, individually wrapped, as if each carried a chain of transmission worth recording. Not one would comfortably manage the lock plate seen in the lower passage. If they were intended to open anything, it was not the same kind of barrier. The manuscript page, on the table, complicates this further. Painted keys appear in the margin, while real keys of different metals lie beside it. Ceremonial forms, iron forms, miniature forms. The text links keys not only to keeping and guarding, but to favor conferred, protection extended, blessing carried outward. That makes the cloth packets intelligible. A key could travel without any corresponding door. It could signify delegated access, or sanctified contact, or a right granted under Peter's name. Yet, the practical question does not go away. Why preserve the iron ring in the lower passage, if the true function had already migrated into token and text? Why do some shafts match the depth of old lock housings while the portable examples do not? Why do records keep the same word, key, for objects that belong to different scales, different metals, different settings, and apparently different tasks? By this point, the search for one original master key feels less useful than the layout itself. Above, crossed metals under glass. Below, black iron near controlled thresholds. Between them, packets small enough to be carried across kingdoms. The question is no longer whether the keys of St. Peter opened something. The question is how many kinds of opening were being preserved under the same name, and which of those uses came first. The first thing that seems answerable is scale. In the treasury, jeweled ceremonial keys sit on one shelf, iron keys on another. The gold and silver pair are broad in the bow, long in the shaft, and finished for display. Nearby, a bronze gate before a tomb chamber carries a lock plate no larger than a hand. No one looking at both at once would try to fit the treasury pair into that gate. The oversized forms belong comfortably beneath the crossed key emblem of the papacy, where they read as office, not hardware. If the question is what the keys of St. Peter were intended to open, the obvious answer appears to be, not a lock at all, but authority itself. That answer holds until the iron examples are brought into the same frame. One lies beside a crystal case containing fragments of Peter's chains. Another hangs below, in the dimmer passage near the barred threshold of the basilica. These are not enlarged insignia. Their shafts are narrow enough for actual keyhole. One bit is bright at the edges where iron has repeatedly met iron. Another shows fatigue where the bow joins the stem, the kind of stress that comes from turning under resistance. If these were only reminders of authority, why do they carry the wear of use? The tomb chamber offers a tempting fit. A locked bronze gate stands directly beneath the papal emblem. A guarded threshold under St. Peter's altar would explain why keys associated with him were preserved, restricted, and remembered. Early references to access below the confessio make practical sense of the iron forms. At last the object and the place seem to meet. These were shrine keys, intended to open protected approaches to Peter's burial. Then the inventory spreads out. In one room, functional iron keys and jeweled ceremonial keys occupy neighboring shelves. In another, small key relics are displayed above while the lower threshold remains barred. The iron examples do not agree with one another. Their shafts differ in length. Their wards are cut to different patterns. One would suit a deep-set lock, another a shallower plate, another hardly any robust mechanism at all. A single tomb gate does not ask for this variety. Separate barriers do. A grill, a chest, an inner door, a reliquary housing chains. The question narrows and then widens again. Which threshold was Peter's key meant for? If several thresholds were treated as his, the smallest keys complicate the matter further. Some are too slight for heavy doors. Their bows are polished smooth from handling, yet their bits are blunt, with little depth for serious engagement. They appear in contexts with ampullae, badges, cloth packets, and other portable devotional objects. Set beside the crystal case of Peter's chains, they suggest contact rather than custody. Keys touched to shrine or chain, then carried away as sanctioned fragments of access. That would explain why so many survive, and why some need no matching lock. But not all of them can be absorbed there. The larger iron keys still show mechanical wear at the bit and dark residue near the working end, the kind left by repeated entry into a maintained lock. The barred threshold below remains physically separate from the bright display above. One set of keys seems to have opened doors that stayed under control. Another seems to have opened proximity itself, by touch, by transfer, by relic logic. The surviving tradition preserves both without sorting them cleanly. So the question remains active in the room. Not what one key opened, but how many kinds of opening were being claimed at once.